I'm Greg Roskopf, owner of Muscle Activation Technique. I got a casual day here with Ben Pakulski, the pro bodybuilder, and we're just going through some conversations, and one of the topics that seems to be a common theme with questions in the MAT community or patients of MAT is, what is our view on stretching? And really the key is we don't really have a view as much as we want to recognize the ramifications that are there if you do put a force on somebody's body. And we have to recognize that when we do stretch our clients, we're actually putting a force on their body and their muscular tissue. So one of the things that we've talked about before is when we're looking from a muscle contractile capability standpoint, we're testing to determine whether or not muscles can contract under load in a shortened position. So here I'm testing the muscles on Ben that relate to trunk rotation. And as I test those muscles, I'm testing in the shortened position in trunk rotation where I have the thorax fixed and the pelvis rotating about a fixed thorax. So if I was to notice that there was a limitation in range of motion, it would be telling me that the muscles that actually move him into that position are potentially weak. So the testing actually validates whether or not there's a weakness or if it tests strong. Well, I'm feeling symmetrical motion at this point, and one of the keys is now, what is my view on stretching? If I was taking Ben into a shortened position or lengthened position of the opposite muscles, I could passively stretch him into spinal rotation. So the question is whether or not he can handle that stress. It's not whether or not stretching is good or bad. I want to know that if I stretch him in the position of trunk rotation, relative to this specific example, can he tolerate that force? And the nice thing about muscle activation techniques is we have the ability to assess. So initially he showed up with a strong test in both sides in trunk rotation. Then I bring him back I stretched him into trunk rotation. Now I bring him right back into that position and I test his range of motion or test his strength in trunk rotation, and he's still strong. So in that situation, I'm comfortable with the fact that he can tolerate that force. So stretching relative to trunk rotation, his body's saying, I'm capable of tolerating that force, and I'll tell you, from my experience, if it's not bad, then it's got the potential to be good. So this could help reinforce his mobility and stability that we're seeing relative to trunk rotation. Now we'll take another example. Just historically, I know that Ben has had some shoulder issues predominant for shoulder issues in his right shoulder relative to external rotation. So when I check his range of motion and external rotation, he's got a slight limitation in range of motion, end feel, a little harder end feel, not as much motion on the right side. So that's telling me really that the muscles that move him into external rotation, there's a potential vulnerability there. So I'm just going to test the motion and his strength in external rotation. This is testing the fibers of the infraspinatus. And they're testing strong. So even though there's a limitation in range of motion, at this moment in time, relative to the forces that have been placed on his body, it's still testing strong. But now we could use the analogy from a mobility standpoint. We could say, well, he's tighter on the right side than he is on the left side. So let's stretch the right side because we want to increase his mobility in external rotation. So I could do a contract, relax, go ahead and contract into internal rotation, then relax. Contract and relax, contract, relax. So we're doing it pretty quickly for demonstration purposes, and relax. But as I do the contract, relax stretches, that just increases his range by at least 10 degrees, maybe more. So we know one thing, that he has increased through performing the contract, relax stretching, we've increased his mobility. Now the question is, does he have stability in that range? And now he's testing weak. So in this situation where there was a limitation in range of motion, which is indicating a vulnerability, I stretched him in the position of his limitation in range of motion, and it actually created a weakness in the muscles that are actually shortening into that position. So the infraspinatus superior division actually tests weak now. So it actually made those muscles weak. So we have two different scenarios here. And when I was assessing trunk rotation, range of motion was symmetrical, I stretched him passively. I used two different dynamics here, but I stretched him passively in that position. Didn't cause any inhibition, didn't show up as being weak. We found the limitation in range of motion in our conventional thought processes is this is where we need to increase mobility. So we apply a contract, relax, stretch, repeated contract, relax, stretch on the to try and stretch the internal rotators, which in turn is shortening the external rotators and really potentially violating a protective mechanism that is really showing that those muscles were potentially weak. We stretch it, the muscles ends up testing weak after the stretch. So now in one scenario, stretching's fine. In another scenario, stretching actually created a weakness. The question I would ask is, do we want to create a weakness on our client before we send them out to the gym and load their body with other external forces? So is stretching a bad thing? In the right environment, stretching can actually provide optimal effects. In the wrong environment, it could set you up for injury. Basically, if you have mobility without stability, you have vulnerability for injury. So the last thing we want to do is stretch someone prior to exercise if we don't have the tools to be able to assess to determine whether or not it made them weak. And with muscle activation techniques, it provides the tools to be able to assess to determine whether you had a positive effect or a negative effect. In this situation, I can correct this and then stimulate the external rotators, which in turn would give him mobility through that range of motion. Now I have mobility and stability, which means we don't have vulnerability for injury. So the goal behind muscle activation techniques is to provide a sense of stability, then the body will give you all the mobility in the world.